the janitor himself was the culprit? Oh. Of course, he could not prove it, so he accepted the loss with disappointment. Some friends offered replacements for his old typewriter and tape recorder. In a letter to India, he described that the theft as a loss of more than 1,000 rupees. Oh, $157. It is understood that such crime as has been committed in my room is very common in New York. This is the way of material nature. American people have everything in ample, and the worker gets about rupees 100 as daily wages. And still there are thieves for want of character. The social condition is not very good. Prabhupada had told Joseph Forrester, the Scindia ticket agent, that he would be returning to India in a couple of months. That was 7 months ago. Now, for the first time since his arrival, Prabhupada had returned to the Scindia ticket office in Brooklyn. He talked about the theft to Mr. Forster, who responded with "Welcome to the club," and told Prabhupada about the recent theft of his own automobile. Such things, he explained, were not unusual for New York City. He told Prabhupada of the dangers of the city and how to avoid thefts and muggings. Prabhupada listened, shaking his head. He told Mr. Forster that American young people were misguided and confused. He discussed his plans for returning to India and showed Mr. Forster one of his Bhagavatams. Prabhupada had lost his spirit for living in room 307. What would prevent the janitor from stealing again? Harvey Cohen and Bill Epstein had advised him to relocate downtown and had assured him of a more interested following among the young people there. It had been an attractive proposal, and he began to reconsider it. Then Harvey offered Prabhupada his studio on the Bowery. Harvey had been working as a commercial artist for a Madison Avenue advertising firm when a recently acquired inheritance had spurred him to move into a loft on the Bowery to pursue his own career as a painter. But he was becoming disillusioned with New York. A group of acquaintances addicted to heroin had been coming around and taking advantage of his generosity, and his loft had recently been burglarized. He decided to leave the city and go to California, but before leaving, he offered his loft for Prabhupada to share with David Allen. David Allen had heard that Harvey Cohen was moving to San Francisco if he could sublet his AIR loft. Harvey hadn't known David very long, but on the night before Harvey was supposed to leave, he coincidentally met David 3 different times in 3 different places on the Lower East Side. Harvey took this as a sign that he should rent the loft to David, but he specifically stipulated that the Swami should move into along with him. As Prabhupada was preparing to leave his 72nd Street address, an acquaintance, an electrician who worked in the building, came to warn him. The Bowery was no place for a gentleman, he protested. It was the most corrupt place in the world. Prabhupada's things had been stolen from room 307, but moving to the Bowery was not the answer. Srila Prabhupada's new home, the Bowery, had a long history. In the early 1600s, when Manhattan was known as New Amsterdam and was controlled by the Dutch West India Company, Peter Miniert, the governor of New Netherland, staked out a north-south road that was called the Bowery. Because a number of Boweries or farms lay on either side, It was a dusty country road lined with quaint Dutch cottages and bordered by the peach orchards growing in the estate of Peter Stuyvesant. It became part of the high road to Boston and was of strategic importance during the American Revolution as the only land entrance to New York City. In the early 1800s, the Bowery was predominated by German immigrants. Later in the century, it became predominantly Jewish, and gradually it became the city's center of theatrical life. However, as the history of Lower Manhattan describes, after 1870 came the period of Bowery's celebrated degeneration. Fake auction rooms, saloons specialized in 5-cent whiskey and knockout drops, sensational dime museums, filthy and rat-ridden stale beer dives, together with Charles M. White's song, the Bowery, I will never go there anymore, fixed it forever in the nation's consciousness as a place of unspeakable corruption. The reaction of Prabhupada's electrician friend was not unusual. The Bowery is still known all over the world as Skid Row, a place of ruined and homeless alcoholics. Oh. Perhaps the uptown electrician had done business in the Bowery and had seen the derelicts sitting around passing a bottle or lying unconscious in the gutter or staggering up to passers-by and drunkenly bumping into them to ask for money. Most of the Bowery's 7,000 or 8,000 homeless men slept in lodging houses that required them to vacate their rooms during the day. Having nowhere else to go and nothing else to do, they would loiter on the street, standing silently on the sidewalks, leaning against a wall, or shuffling slowly along, alone or in groups. In cold weather, they would wear 2 coats and several suits of clothes at once and would sometimes warm themselves around a fire they would keep going in a city garbage can. At night, those without lodging slept on the sidewalks, doorsteps, and street corners, crawled into discarded boxes, or sprawled side by side next to the bars. Thefts were commonplace. A man's pockets might be searched 10 or 20 times while he slept. The rates of hospitalization and death in the Bowery were 5 times higher than the national average, and many of the homeless men bore marks of recent injuries or violence. Prabhupada's loft 94 Bowery was 6 blocks south of Houston Street. At Houston and Bowery, derelicts converged in the heavy crosstown traffic. When cars stopped from the light, bums would come up and wash the windshields and ask for money. South of Houston, the first blocks held mostly restaurants, supply stores, lamp stores, taverns, and luncheonettes. The buildings were of 3 and 4 stories, old, narrow, crowded tenements, their faces covered with heavy fire escapes. Traffic on the Bowery ran uptown and downtown. Cars parked on both sides of the street, and the constant traffic passed tightly. During the business day, working people passed briskly among the slow-moving derelicts. Many of the store windows were covered with protective iron gates, but behind the gates, the store owners lit their varieties of lamps to attract prospective wholesale and retail customers. Arya Karame? Okay. Prabhu, could you please take over?
Yeah.
Thank you.
94 Bowery was just 2 doors north of Hester Street. The corner was occupied by the spacious Half Moon Tavern, which was frequented mostly by neighborhood alcoholics. Above the tavern sat a 4-story Bowery flop house marked by a neon sign, Palma House, which was covered by a protective metal cage and hung from the second floor on large chains. The hotel's entrance at 92 Bowery, which had no lobby but only a desolate hallway covered with dirty white tiles, was no more than 6 feet from the entrance to 94. 94 Bowery was a narrow 4-story building. It had long ago been painted gray and bore the usual facing of a massive black fire escape. A well-worn black double door, its glass panels reinforced with chicken wire opened onto the street. The sign above the door read AIR 3rd and 4th, indicating that artists in residence occupied these floors. So the first floor of the next building north, 96 Bowery, was used for storage, and its front entrance was covered with a rusty iron gate. At 98 Bowery was another tavern, Harold's, smaller and dingier than the Half Moon. Thus the block consisted of 2 saloons, a flop house, and 2 buildings with lofts. In 1960s, loft living was just beginning in that area of New York City. The city had given permission for painters, musicians, sculptors, and other artists who require more space than available in most apartments to live in buildings that had been constructed as factories in the 19th century. After this, abandoned factories had been fitted with fireproof doors, bathtubs, shower stalls, and heating. An artist could inexpensively use a large space. These were the AIR lofts. Harvey Coven's loft on the top floor of 94 Bowery was an open space almost 100 feet long from east to west and 20 feet wide. It received a good amount of sunlight on the east, the Bowery side, and it also had windows at the west end as well as skylight. The exposed rafters of the ceiling were 12 feet above the floor. Harvey Cohen had used the loft as an art studio, and racks for painting still lined the wall. A kitchen and shower were partitioned off in the northwest corner, and a room divider stood about 15 feet from the Bowery side windows. This divider did not run from wall to wall, but was open at both ends, and it has a several feet short of the ceiling. It was behind this partition that Prabhupada had his personal living area. A bed and few chairs stood near the window, and Prabhupada's typewriter sat on his metal trunk next to a small table that held his stacks of Srimad Bhagavatam manuscripts. His dhotis hung drying on a clothesline. On the other side of the partition was the dais, about 10 feet wide and 5 feet deep, on which Prabhupada sat during the kirtans and lectures. The dais faced west towards the loft's large open space, that is, except for a couple of rugs and an old-fashioned solid wood table and an easel. Harvey's painting of Lord Chaitanya dancing with his associates. The loft was a 4-flight walk-up, and the only entrance, usually heavily bolted, was a door in the rear at the west end. From the outside, this door opened into hallway lit only by a red exit light over the door. The hallway led to the right a few steps and into open area. If a guest entered during a kirtan or a lecture, he would see the Swami about 30 feet from the entrance seated on his dais. On the other evenings, the whole loft would be dark, but for the glow of the red exit light in the little hallway and a soft illuminating light radiating from the other side of the partition where Prabhupada was working. Prabhupada lived on the Bowery, sitting under a small light, while hundreds of derelicts also sat under hundreds of naked lights on the same city block. He had no more fixed income than the derelicts, nor any greater security of a fixed residence. Yet his consciousness was different. He was translating Srimad Bhagavatam into English, speaking to the world through his Bhaktivedanta purports. His duty, whether on the 14th floor of a Riverside Drive apartment building or in a corner of a Bowery loft, was to establish Krishna consciousness as a prime necessity for all humanity. He went on with his translating and with his constant vision of a Krishna temple in the New York City. Because of his consciousness was absorbed in Krishna's universal mission, he did not depend on his surroundings for shelter. Home for him was not a matter of bricks and wood, but of taking shelter of Krishna in every circumstance. As Prabhupada had said to his friends uptown, everywhere is my home, whereas without Krishna's shelter, the whole world would be a desolate place. Often he would refer to a scriptural statement that people live in three different modes: goodness, passion, ignorance. Life in the forest is in the mode of goodness, life in the city is passion, and life in the great place like liquor shop, brothel, or the brewery is in the mode of ignorance. But to live in a temple of Vishnu is to live in the spiritual world Vaikuntha, which is transcendental to all material modes. And this Bowery loft, where Prabhupada was holding his meetings and performing kirtan, was also transcendental. When he was behind a partition working in his corner before the open base of Srimad Bhagavatam, that room was as good as his room back at Radha Damodar temple in Vrindavan. News of the Swami's move to the Bowery loft spread, mostly by word of mouth at the Paradox restaurant, and people began to come by in the evening to chant with him. The musical kirtanas were especially popular on the Bowery since the Swami's new congregation consisted mostly of local musicians and artists who responded more to the transcendental music than to the philosophy. Every morning he would hold a class on Srimad Bhagavatam, attended by David Allen, Robert Nelson, and another boy, and occasionally he would teach cooking to whoever was interested. He was usually available for personal talks with any inquiring visitors or with his new roommate. Although Prabhupada and David each had a designated living area in the large loft, the entire place soon became dominated by Prabhupada's preaching activities. Prabhupada and David got on well together, and at first Prabhupada considered David an aspiring disciple. April 27, he wrote to his friends in India describing his relationship with David Allen. He was attending my classes at 72nd Street along with others. When I experienced this theft case in my room, he invited me to his residence. So I'm with him, training him. He has a good prospect because already he has given up all bad habits. In this country, illicit connection with women, smoking, drinking, and eating of meats are common affairs. Besides that, there are other bad habits like using only toilet paper and not bathing after evacuating, etc. But by my request, he has given up 90% of his old habits. He is chanting Mahamantra regularly. So I'm giving him the chance, and I think he is improving. Tomorrow, I have arranged for some prasadam distribution, and he has gone to purchase some things from the market. So when David first came to the Bowery, he appeared like a clean-cut college student. He was 21, 6 feet tall, blue-eyed, handsome, and intelligent-looking. Most of his new friends in New York are older and considered him a kid. David's family lived in East Lansing, Michigan, and his mother was paying $100 monthly to sublease the loft. Although he did not have much experience, he had read that a new realm of mind expansion was available through psychedelic drugs, and he was heading fast into the hazardous world of LSD. His meeting with Swami came at a time of radical change and profoundly affected his life. David, it was really a good relationship I had with the Swami, but I was overwhelmed by the tremendous energy of being that close to him. It spurred my consciousness very fast. Even my dreams at night would be so vivid of Krishna consciousness. I was often sleeping when the Swami was up because he was up late in the night working on his translation. Thus, possibly where a lot of the consciousness and dreams just floating because of the deep relationship. It also had to do with studying Sanskrit. There was a lot of immediate impact with the language. The language seemed to have such a strong mystical quality, the way he translated it word for word. So Prabhupada's old friend from Uptown, Robert Nelson, continued to visit him on the Bowery. He was impressed by Prabhupada's friendly relationship with David, who he was learning many things from the Swami. Mr. Robert bought a small American-made hand organ similar to an Indian harmonium and donated it to David for chanting with Prabhupada. At 7 in the morning, Mr. Robert would come by, and after Bhagavatam class, he would talk informally to Prabhupada, telling his ideas of making records and selling books. He wanted to continue helping the Swami. They would sit in chairs near the front window, and Mr. Robert would listen while Prabhupada talked for hours about Krishna and Lord Chaitanya. New people began coming to see Prabhupada on the Bowery. Carl Eugens, a 30-year-old black man from Bronx, had attended Cornell University and was now independently studying Indian religion and Jain Buddhism. He had experimented with drugs as psychedelic tools, and he had an interest in the music and poetry of India. He was influential among his friends and tried to interest them in meditation. He had been dabbling in Sanskrit. Carl, I had just finished reading a book called The Wonder That Was India. I had gotten the definition of a sannyasi and a brahmachari and so forth. There was a vivid description in the particular book of how you could see a sannyasi coming down the road with a saffron robe. It must have made more than just a superficial impression on me because it came to me this one chilly evening. I was going to visit Michael Grant. This is Mukunda Maharaj. Probably going to smoke some marijuana and sit around and maybe play some music. And I was coming down Hester Street. If you make a left turn, Bowery, you can go up to Mike's place on Grand Street. But it is so funny that I choose to go that way because the shorter way would have been to go down Grand Street. But if I had gone that way, I would probably have missed Swamiji. So I decided to go down Hester and then make a left. All of a sudden, I saw in this dingy alcove a brilliant saffron robe. As I passed, I saw it was Swamiji knocking on the door, trying to gain entrance. There were two bumps hunched up against the door. It was like a two-part door. One of them was sealed, another was locked. The two bumps were lying on either side of Swamiji. One of these men had actually expired. Oh my God. Which often happened, and you had to call the police or health department to get them. I don't think I saw the man lying in the doorway until I walked up to Swamiji and asked, "Are you a sannyasi?" And he answered, "Yes." We started this conversation about how he was starting a temple, and he mentioned Lord Chaitanya and the whole thing. He just came out with this flow of strange things to me right there in the street. But I knew what he was talking about somehow. I had the familiarity of having just read this book and dwelled into Indian religion. So I knew that this was a momentous occasion for me, and I wanted to help him. We banged on the door, and eventually we got into the loft. He invited me to come to a kirtan, and I came back later that night for my first kirtan. From that point on, it was a fairly regular thing, 3 times a week. At one point, Swamiji asked me to stay with him, and I stayed for about 2 weeks. It was perhaps because of Carl's interest in Sanskrit that Prabhupada began holding Sanskrit classes. So Carl and David and few others would spend hours learning Sanskrit under Prabhupada's guidance. Using a chalkboard he found in the loft, Prabhupada taught the alphabet, and his students wrote their exercises in notebooks. Prabhupada would look over their shoulders to see if they're writing correctly and would review their pronunciation. His students were learning not simply Sanskrit, but the instructions of Bhagavad Gita. Each day he would give them a verse to copy in the Sanskrit alphabet Devanagari, translate it into the Roman alphabet, and then translate word for word into English. But their interest in Sanskrit waned, and Prabhupada gradually gave up daily classes to spend time working on his own translation of the Srimad Bhagavatam. His new friends may have regarded these lessons as Sanskrit classes, but actually they were Bhakti classes. He had not come to America as the ambassador of Sanskrit. His Guru Maharaj had ordered him to teach Krishna consciousness, but since he had found in Carl and some of his friends a desire to investigate Sanskrit, he encouraged it. As a youth, Lord Chaitanya had also started a Sanskrit school with the real purpose of teaching love of Krishna. He would teach in such a way that every word meant Krishna, and when he students objected, he closed the school. Similarly, when Prabhupada found that his students' interest in Sanskrit was transitory, and since he himself had no mission on behalf of Sanskrit linguistics, he gave it up. So that's what we should also do. If there is somewhere we can encourage, but if it is not missionary, don't give much attention. Because it's going to come across many things. By the standard of classical Vedic scholars, it takes 10 years for a boy to master Sanskrit grammar. And if one does not start until his late 20s or 30s, it is usually too late. Certainly, none of Swamiji's students were thinking of entering a 10-year concentration in Sanskrit grammar. And even if they are, they would not realize spiritual truth simply by becoming grammarians. Prabhupada thought it better to utilize his own Sanskrit scholarship in translating the verses of Srimad Bhagavatam into English, following the Sanskrit commentaries of the previous authorities. Otherwise, the secrets of Krishna consciousness would remain locked away in the Sanskrit. Teaching Carl Eugen's Devanagari, Sandhi, verb conjunctions, and noun declensions was not going to give the people of America transcendental Vedic knowledge. Better that he utilize his proficiency in Sanskrit for translating many volumes of the Bhagavatam into English for millions of potential readers. Carol Becker came from an immigrant Catholic background, and she immediately associated with Catholicism the Swami's presence as a spiritual authority and his devotional practices of chanting on beads and reciting from Sanskrit scriptures. Sometimes she would accompany Prabhupada to nearby Chinatown, where he would purchase ingredients for his cooking. He would cook daily, and sometimes Carol and others would come by to learn the secrets of cooking for Lord Krishna. So at this point, Prabhupada doesn't have an income yet, but I think he was just relying on the book sales and whatever little donations, I believe. Carol, he used to cook with us in the kitchen, and he was always aware of everyone else's activities in addition to his own cooking. He knew exactly how things should be. He watched everything and make sure everyone did everything correctly. He was a teacher. We used to make chapatis by hand, but then one day he asked me to get him a rolling pin. I brought my rolling pin and he appreciated it. He put some men on rolling chapatis and supervised them very carefully. I made chutney for him at home. He always accepted our gifts graciously, although I did not think he ever ate them. Perhaps he was worried he might put into something that wasn't allowed in his diet. He used to take things from me, but put them in the cupboard. I don't know exactly what he finally did with them, but I'm sure he did not throw them away. I never saw him eat anything that I had prepared, although he accepted everything. Prabhupada held his evening meetings on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, just as he had uptown. The loft was out of the way for most of his acquaintances, and it was on the Bowery. A cluster of sleeping derelicts regularly blocked the street level entrance, and visitors would find as many as half a dozen bumps to step over before climbing the four flights of stairs. But it was something new. You could go and sit with a group of his people, Hippo people, and watch the Swami lead Kirtan. The room was dimly lit and Prabhupada would burn incense. Many casual visitors came and went. One of them, Gandhar, had vivid impressions. Gandhar. You walked right off the Bowery into a room filled with incense. It was quiet. Everyone was talking into hushed tones, not really talking at all. Swamiji was sitting in the front of the room and in meditation. There was a tremendous feeling of peace. Not this one, there was a tremendous feeling of peace, which I have never had before. Usually when we read scriptures, especially in Gita Mahatmya, there are some chapters, there is a devotee who recites a particular chapter, like 4th chapter every day, and the whole village is permeated with peace. I had happened to have studied for 2 years to become a minister and was into meditation, study, and prayer. But this was my first time to do anything Eastern or Hindu. There were lots of pillows around and mats on the floor for people to sit on. I don't think there were any pictures or statues. It was just Swamiji, incense and mats, and obviously the respect of the people in the room for him. Before we went up, Carl was laughing and saying how Swamiji wanted everyone to use the hand symbols just correctly. I never played the symbols before, but when it began, I just tried to follow Swamiji, who was doing it in a certain way. Things were building up and the sound was building up, but then someone was doing it wrong. And Swamiji just very, very calmly shook a finger at someone and they looked, and then everything stopped. He instructed this person from a distance, and this fellow got the right idea and they started up again. After a few minutes, the sound of cymbals and the incense, we were not in the Bori any longer. We started chanting Hare Krishna. That was my first experience in chanting. I had never chanted before. There was nothing in Protestant religion that comes even close to that. Maybe Catholics with their Hail Marys, but it's not quite the same thing. It was relaxing, very interesting to be able to chant. I found Swamiji very fascinating. So the loft was more open than Prabhupada's previous place uptown, so there was less privacy. And here, some of the visitors were skeptical and even challenging, but everyone found him confident and joyful. He seemed to have far-reaching plans and he had dedication. He knew that he wanted to do as and was single-handedly carrying it out. It is not one man's job, he had said. But he went on doing all he could, depending on Krishna for the results. David was beginning to help, and more people were coming by to visit him. Almost all of Prabhupada's Bowery friends were musicians or friends of musicians. They were put into music, drugs, women, and spiritual meditation. Because Prabhupada's presentation of the Hare Krishna mantra was both musical and meditative, they were automatically interested. Prabhupada stressed that all the Vedic mantras or hymns were sung. In fact, the words Bhagavad Gita meant the song of God. But the words of the Vedic hymns were incarnations of God in the form of transcendental sound. The musical accompaniment, hand cymbals, drum, and harmonium was just that, an accompaniment. He had no spiritual purpose independent of chanting the names of God. Perhaps allowed any instrument to be used as long as it does not detract from the chanting. Carol. It was a very interracial music-oriented scene. There were like a few professional musicians and a lot of people who enjoyed playing or just listening. Some people were painting in some of the lots, and that's basically what was going on. We had memorable kirtans. One time there was a beautiful ceremony. Some of us went over and went out early to prepare for it. There must have been 100 people who came that day. From the Bowery crowds, sound was spirit and spirit was sound in a merging of music and meditation. But for Prabhupada, the music without the names of God was in meditation. It was a sense gratification or at most a kind of a stylized in-person meditation. But he was glad to see the musicians coming to play along in his kirtans, to hear him and to chant responsively. Some, having stayed up all night playing somewhere on their instruments, would come by in the morning, sing with the Swami. He did not dissuade them from their focus on sound. Rather, he gave them the sound. In Veda, sound is said to be the first element of mental creation. The source of sound is God, and the God is eternally a person. Prabhupada's emphasis was on getting people to chant God's personal transcendental name. Whether they took it as a jazz or folk music or rock or Indian meditation made no difference as long as they began to chant Hare Krishna. Can someone in a position to read? I'm not able to move along.
Yes, Prabhu. Um,
Carol, whenever he had the chanting, the people were fairly in awe of the Swami. On the Bauri, a kind of transcendence came out of the ringing of the cymbals. He used the harmonium, and many people played hand cymbals. Sometimes he played the drum. In the very beginning, he stressed the importance of sound and the realization of God through the sound. That was, I suppose, the attraction that these musicians found in him, the emphasis on the sound as a means to attaining transcendence and the Godhead. But he wanted a serious thing. He was interested in discipleship.
One serious newcomer was Michael Grant. Mike was 24. His father, who was Jewish, owned a record shop in Portland, Oregon, where Mike grew up. After studying music in Portland's Reed College and at San Francisco State, Mike, who played the piano and many other instruments, moved to New York City along with his girlfriend, hoping to get into music professionally. But he quickly became disenchanted with the commercial music scene. Playing in nightclubs and pandering to commercial demands seemed particularly unappealing. In New York, he joined the Musicians Union and worked as a musical arranger and as an agent for several local groups. Mike lived on the Bowery in an AIR loft on Grand Street. It was a large loft where musicians often congregated for jam sessions. But as he turned more and more to serious composing, he found himself retiring from the social side of the music scene. His interests ran more to the spiritual, quasi-spiritual and mystical books he had been reading. He had encountered several swamis, yogis, and self-styled spiritualists in the city and had taken up hatha yoga. From his first meeting with the Swami, Mike was interested and quite open, as he was with all religious persons. He thought all genuinely religious people were good, although he did not care to identify with any particular group. Mike. There was a little bit of familiarity because I had seen other Swamis. The way he was dressed, the way he looked, older and swarthy weren't new to me. But at the same time, there was an element of novelty. I was curious. I didn't hear him talk when I first came in. He was just chanting. But mainly, I was waiting to hear what he was going to say. I had already heard people chant before. I thought, why else would he put himself in such a place without any comforts, unless the message he's trying to get across is more important than his own comfort? I think the thing that struck me the most was the poverty that was all around him. Wow. Sorry, I want to highlight this. Yeah. Around him. This was curious because the places that I had been before had been just the opposite. Very opulent. There was a Vedanta center in Upper Manhattan and others. They were filled with staid older men and with leather chairs and pipe tobacco. That kind of environment. But this was real poverty. The whole thing was curious. The Swami looked very refined, which was also curious that he was in this place. When he talked, I immediately saw that he was a scholar and that he spoke with great conviction. Some statements he made were very daring. He was talking about God, and this was all new, to hear someone talk about God. I always wanted to hear someone I could respect talk about God. I always liked to hear religious speakers, but I measured them very carefully. When he spoke, I began to think, well, here is someone talking about God who may really have some realization of God. He was the first one I had come across who might be a person of God, who could feel really deeply. Prabhupada is lecturing. Sri Krishna is just trying to place Arjuna on the platform of working in pure consciousness. We have already discussed for so many days that we are not this dull body, but we are consciousness. Somehow or other, we are in contact with matter. Therefore, our freedom is checked. Attendance is better now than it had been uptown. The loft offers a larger space. In fact, the platform where Prabhupada sits nearly equals the area of his entire office cubicle on 72nd Street. The dingy loft with its unpainted rafters is more like an old warehouse than a temple. The members of his audience, most of them musicians, have come to meditate on the mystical sounds of the Swami's Kirtan. Carl, Carol, Gunther, Mike, David, the crowd from the Paradox, and others join him on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday night, when he holds classes beginning punctually at 8 o'clock. The program consists of half an hour of chanting Hare Krishna, followed by a lecture from Bhagavad Gita, usually 45 minutes long. Then a question-answer period, and finally another half hour of chanting, everything ending by 10 o'clock. The Kirtan had just ended and Swamiji is speaking. As spiritual beings, we are free to act, free to have anything, pure, no contamination, no disease, no birth, no death, no old age. And besides that, we have got many, many other qualifications in our spiritual life. When he speaks, he is pure spiritual form. The Vedic scriptures say that a sadhu, a saint, is not seen but heard. If the people in the audience want to know Swamiji, they will have to hear him. He is no longer simply an old Indian immigrant who lives on the other side of the partition of this loft, hanging his clothes to dry, barely getting his meals. But now he is speaking as the emissary of Lord Krishna, beyond time and space, and hundreds of spiritual masters in the chain of disciplic succession are speaking through him. Wow. He had entered amid New York's bohemians in 1966, saying that 1966 is temporary and illusory, and he is eternal, and they are eternal. This was the meaning of the Kirtan, and now he is explaining it philosophically, advocating a total change in consciousness. Yet knowing that they can't take it all, he urges them to take whatever they can. You will be glad to hear that this process of spiritual realization, once begun, guarantees one to have his next life as a human being. Once karma yoga is begun, it will continue. It doesn't matter. Even if one fails to complete the course, still he is not a loser. He is not a loser. Now, if someone begins this yoga of self-realization, but unfortunately cannot prosecute this task in a nice way, if he falls down from the path, still there is encouragement that you are not a loser. You will be given a chance next life, and the next life. And the next life is not ordinary next life. And for one who is successful, oh, what to speak of him. The successful goes back to Godhead. So we are holding this class, and although you have multifarious duties, you come here thrice a week and try to understand. And this will not go in vain. Even if you stop coming here, that impression will never go. I tell you, the impression will never go. If you do some practical work, that is very, very nice. But even if you do not do any practical work, simply if you give your submissive oral reception and understand what is the nature of God, if you simply hear and have an idea, even, then you will be free from this material bondage. He is talking to a crowd who are deeply set in their hip life. He knows that they can't immediately give up taking drugs, and there they sit with their common law wives. Their path is to play music, live with a woman, and meditate sometimes, and be free. After hearing his lecture, they'll stay up all night with their instruments, their women, their drugs, their interracial bohemian scene. Yet, somehow they are drawn to Swamiji. He's got the good vibrations of the Kirtan, and they want to help him out. They're glad to help because he has no one else. So Prabhupada is saying to them, that's all right. Even if you can only do a little, it will be good for you. We are all pure spirit souls, but you have forgotten. You have fallen into the cycle of birth and death. Whatever you can do towards reviving your original consciousness is good for you. There is no loss. The Swami's main stress is on what he calls dovetailing your consciousness with the supreme consciousness. Krishna is the supreme consciousness, and Arjuna, as the representative individual consciousness, is asked to act intelligently in collaboration with the supreme consciousness. Then he will be free from the bondage of birth, death, old age, and disease. Consciousness is a popular word in America. There's consciousness expansion, cosmic consciousness, altered states of consciousness, and now dovetailing the individual consciousness with the supreme consciousness. This is the perfection of consciousness, Prabhupada explains. This is the love and peace that everyone is really after. And yet, Prabhupada talks of it in terms of war. They're talking on the battlefield, and Arjuna says, I will not fight. I will not fight with my relatives and brothers for the sake of achieving some kingdom. No, no. Now, to the ordinary man, it appears that, oh, Arjuna is a very nice man, non-violent. He has given up everything for the sake of his relatives. Oh, what a nice man he is. This is the ordinary calculation. But what does Krishna say? He says, you are damned fool number one. Now just see, the things which are estimated in the public eye as very nice, very good, that is here condemned by God. So you have to see whether the supreme consciousness is pleased with your actions. And Arjuna's consciousness was not approved by Lord Krishna. It was for his own whim, sense gratification, that at first he would not fight. But at the end, for Krishna's satisfaction, he did fight. And that is our perfection. When we act for the satisfaction of the supreme consciousness, at this point, some in the audience are filled with reservations. They are all opposed to the role of the United States in Vietnam, and this idea is very difficult for them. Like Arjuna, they want peace. So why is Swami sanctioning war? He explains, yes, Arjuna's idea not to fight is good, but then Krishna, the supreme consciousness, instructs him to fight anyway. Therefore, Arjuna's fighting is above mundane ethics. It is absolute. If we follow Arjuna, give up good and bad, but act for Krishna, not for our sense gratification, then that is perfect. Because Krishna is the supreme consciousness. To some in this audience, although his answer seems philosophically sound, it is not quite what they want to hear. Still, they want to know his political views. Does he support America's involvement in Vietnam? Is he anti-war? But Prabhupada is neither hawk nor dove. He has no political motive behind his example of Krishna and Arjuna. His theme is simple and pure. Beyond the good and the bad is the absolute. And to act in accord with the absolute is also beyond the good and bad. But what about Vietnam? Does Krishna say to fight there? No, Swamiji answers. The Vietnam War is different from Kurukshetra War. In the Battle of Kurukshetra, Krishna was personally present asking Arjuna to fight. Vietnam is different. But his audience has yet another objection. If he is not addressing the Vietnamese war, then why not? After all, this is 1966. If he isn't talking about war, then what is his relevancy? The Swami replies that his message is actually the most urgent and relevant. The Vietnam War was an inevitable karmic reaction. It was one symptom, not the whole problem. And only this philosophy, surrender to the Supreme Consciousness, addresses the real problem. But for many, the reference to fighting is so emotionally charged that they can't go beyond the immediate politics of Vietnam to Prabhupada's real message of surrender to the Supreme Consciousness. They respect the Swami. They realize he is referring to a deeper philosophy. Yet the story of Arjuna and the war makes things difficult. The Swami nonetheless continues to refer to Arjuna's fighting as the classic example of Bhagavad Gita's basic teaching. It's not the basic teaching his audience is having difficulty with, it's the example. Prabhupada has deliberately handed his audience a volatile analogy. He hasn't come to join their peace movement, and he doesn't accept their their short-sighted concept of peace. He confronts them. It is better to fight in Krishna consciousness than to live in a so-called peace devoid in a so-called peace devoid of God realization. Yes, the example is harder for them to accept. It makes them think. And if they do accept, then they might come near to understanding the absolute. Is it very difficult dovetailing our consciousness with the Supreme Consciousness? Not at all, not at all. No sane man will say, oh, it is not possible. He isn't suggesting that to dovetail with the Supreme Consciousness, they will have to go to fight in Vietnam or perform some other horrible act on behalf of God. He knows that spiritual life will have to be more attractive than material life, or his audience will never take it. He wants to bring the theme of dovetailing with the Supreme Consciousness down to something practical, something all attractive and beautiful, something anyone could do and anyone could do and would want to do. He wants to encourage them by saying that they can do their own thing, but for Krishna. Arjuna, after all, was a lifetime warrior. Krishna didn't ask him to give up his work, but to do it for the Supreme. So Prabhupada is asking the same of his audience. And they can begin with something as simple as offering their food to God, because everyone has to eat. So God wants to eat something. Why don't you first offer your food to God? Then you eat. But you may say, but if God takes it away, then how shall I eat? No, God will not take it. Daily after preparing our foodstuffs, we are offering to Krishna. There is a witness. Mr. David has seen. Prabhupada laughs. God eats, but his spiritual eating is such that even after his eating, the whole thing is still there. So we shall not suffer a pinch if we dovetail our desires with the Supreme Lord. We simply have to learn the art, how to dovetail. Nothing more has to change. Nothing has to be changed. The fighting man did not change into an artist or a musician. If you are a fighting man, you remain a fighting man. If you're a musician, you remain a musician. If you're a medical man, you remain a medical man. Whatever you are, you remain. But dovetail it. Dovetail it. If by my eating the Lord is satisfied, then that is my perfection. If by my fighting the Lord is satisfied, then that is my perfection. So in every sphere of life, we have to know whether the Lord is satisfied. That technique we have to learn. That then it is as easy as anything. We have to stop creating our own plans and thoughts and take the perfect plans from the Supreme Lord and execute them. That will become the perfection of our life. And Lord Chaitanya had made acting on the platform of consciousness very easy. Just as there are some note makers of school books, easy study. So Lord Chaitanya has recommended that you be engaged in whatever occupation, but just hear about Krishna. Continue to hear the Bhagavad Gita and chant Hare Krishna. It is for this that we are trying to organize this institution. So you have come, and whatever work you do, it doesn't matter. Everything will be adjusted by and by, and our mind will become clear simply by hearing. If you continue this process, chanting the Krishna's name, you will practically see how much your heart is becoming clear, and how much you are making progress towards spiritual realization, the real identity of pure consciousness. Prabhupada is speaking on behalf of the Supreme Consciousness, and he offers his day-to-day activities as an example by dovetailing with the Supreme. I'm here always looking at something, reading or writing. Something, reading or writing. 24 hours. Simply when I feel hungry, I take some food. And simply when I feel sleepy, I go to bed. Otherwise, I don't feel fatigued. Otherwise, I don't feel fatigued. You can ask Mr. David whether I am not doing this.
I'll read, Mataji.
Okay, Prabhu.
I can read, Prabhuji, if you want me to.
Jai Mataji, go for it.
Yeah, I just lost it.
Of course,
Is that,
the Swami's
of course,
daily
okay,
routine.
yeah. Of course, the Swami's daily routine doesn't require certification from David Allen, and any of his regular visitor can see that he is transcendental. His personal life is a perfect example of devoting with the supreme consciousness. Prabhupada has always kept himself dovetailed with the Supreme. He had been perfectly dovetailed in Vrindavanas also and had no personal need or motive to come to America and live on the Bowery. It was for others' sake that he came to the Bowery, and it is for others' benefit that he is speaking tonight. His spiritual master and Lord Krishna want the conditioned souls to come out of their illusion before it is too late, speaking virtuously even until they become physically exhausted, sometimes shouting, sometimes pleading, sometimes laughing. He gives his audience as much as he feels they can take. As the emissary of Krishna and the disciple succession, he can boldly shout that everyone should devote trail with the Supreme. He can speak as strongly as he likes for as long as they are willing to listen. He is a sadhu. The Sanskrit word means saint and one who cuts. And he repeats the same message that the thousands of years sadhus of the original Vedic culture have spoken. Thousands spoken. He is reviving the eternal spirit of the Vedic wisdom to cut the knots of ignorance and illusion. So everything is illusion from the beginning of our birth. And the illusion is strong. It is very difficult to get out of. The whole thing is illusion. Birth is illusion, the body is illusion, the body relationship and the country are illusion. The father is illusion, the mother is illusion, the wife is illusion, the children are illusion. Everything is illusion. And we are contracting the illusion, thinking we are very learned, advanced. We are imagining so many things, but as soon as death comes, the actual fact, then we forgot everything. We forget our country, we forget our reality, we forget our wife, children, father, mother, everything is gone. My grand, I went up to him afterward. I had the same feeling I would had on other occasion when I had been to hear famous people in concerts. I was always interested in going by after concerts to see musicians and singers just to meet them and see what they were like. I had a similar feeling after Swamiji spoke, so I went up and started talking. But the experience was different from the others in that he wasn't in a hurry. He could talk to me, whereas with others, all you could do was get in a few words. They were always more interesting in something else. But he was a person who was actually showing some interest in me as a person, and I was so overwhelmed that I ran out of things to say very quickly. I was surprised. Our meeting broke off on the basis of my not having anything further to say. It was just the opposite of so many other experiences where some performers would be hurrying off to do something else. This time I was the one who couldn't continue. Prabhupada liked to take walks. From his doorsteps at 94 Bowery, he would see directly across the street the Fullerton Hotel, a five-story flop house surrounding him were other lower Manhattan lodging houses, whose tenants wanted the sidewalks from early morning till dark. An occasional flock of pigeons would stir and fly from the rooftop of the next to descend to the street. Traffic was heavy. The Bowery was part of the truck route and to and from Brooklyn by way of the Brooklyn and Manhattan bridges. The Bowery sloped gently downhill towards the north. The Prabhupada could see signboards, a few scraggly Manhattan trees, and the street lights and traffic signals as far up the 4th Street. He could see Con Edison with his prominent clock tower, and if there was no clouds, on top of the Empire State Building on 34th Street. He would walk along in the morning through the Bowery neighborhood. The month of May that year saw more frequent rains than was normal, and Prabhupada carried an umbrella. Sometimes he walked in the rain. He was not always alone. Sometimes he walked with one of his new friends and talked something. He shopped bitter melon, dal, hing, chickpea flour, and other special spices, specialty food common in Indian vegetarian cuisine were available in Chinatown nearby markets. On leaving the loft, he would walk south a few steps of the corner of Bowery and the Hester Street. Turning right on the Hester, he would immediately be a Chinatown, where the shops, market, and even the Manhattan Saving Bank were identified by sign letter in Chinese. Sometimes he would walk one block further south to Canal Street, with his Central Asian food market and many other street side fruits and vegetable market in the early morning. The sidewalks were almost deserted, but as the shops began to open the business, the streets became crowded with the local workers, shopkeepers, tourists, and aimless derelicts. The winding side streets of Chinatown were lined with hundreds of the small stores, and parked cars lined both sides of the street. His walks on Hester would sometimes take him into Little Italy, which overlapped Chinatown to Mulberry Street. In this neighborhood, places like Chai, Chinese pork products and the Mi supermarket store stood alongside Umberto's Clam House and the Puglia restaurant, advertising cappuccinos e la Puglia, coffee from Puglia. His walks west to Bowery into Chinatown and Little Italy were mainly for shopping, but he also noticed prospective sites from the sites for a temple. Chatham Towers or the Chatham Square particularly drew his attention. Sometimes he would walk in the opposite direction as far as the East River and the Brooklyn Bridge. But when his friends warned him that his sniper had been firing at Stoller along the river, he stopped going there. And despite the bad neighborhood where Prabhupada lived and walked, he was rarely disturbed. Often he would find several Bowery bums asleep or unconscious at his door, and he would have to step over them. Sometimes a drunk, simply out of his inability or to maneuver, would bump into him, or a derelict would mutter something unintelligible or laugh at him. The more sober ones would stand and gesture courteously, ushering the Swami into or out of his door at 94 Bowery. He would pass along among them, acknowledging their good manners as they cleared the path. Certainly, few of the Bowery men and the others who saw him on his walk knew much about the small elderly Indian sadhu, dressed in saffron and carrying an umbrella and a brown grocery sack. Sometimes Prabhupada would meet one of his new friends on the street. Jan, Michael Grant's girlfriend, met him on several occasions as he was out walking. Jain, I would see him in the midst of the potpourri or people down there. Walking down the street, he always had an umbrella, and he would always have such a serene look on his face. He would just be taking his afternoon jaunt, walking alone, sometimes sleeping over the draw, and I would always get sort of nervous when I would meet him on the sidewalk. He would say, "Are you chanting?" And I would say, "Sometimes." And then he would say, "That is a good girl." Sitting cross-legged, his back of the shelf with its assortment of potted plants, a whitish chadar wrapped in white, loose folds across his body. Prabhupada looked grave, almost sorrowful. The picture and an accompanying article appeared in a June issue of the Village Voice. The article read, "The meeting of the mystical West and practical East come alive in the curious contrast between A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami and his American disciples. The Swami, a cultivated man of 70 with a distinguished education, is here for a year to preach his gospel of peace, God will, nearness of God, and more practically to raise money for his American church. Like his teaching, the Swami is sensible and direct. His main teaching is that mankind may come close to God by reaching his holy name. Despite the fact that the Swami came to America to seek out the root of godless materialism, a disease, he said, that has already enveloped India. He is a realistic man. Is there any place on earth with money to build a temple? It is here. The Swami wishes to find in America an international society of Krishna consciousness which will be open for anyone, including women. The article had been written by Howard Smith. He had first heard of the Swami by a phone call from the contract who had told him an interesting holy man from India living in a loft in the Bowery. Go there any time. Howard Contract had told him. He's always there. I think you will find it fascinating. I believe he's about to start a major religious movement. Howard Smith. So I went down there and went upstairs into their very funky artist loft. There were carpets all over the place, old and worn out, and a lot of people sitting around in various kind of hippie garb. Plus, what I think they must have thought was Indian garb. Most of them were sitting alone around the room, facing the wall like they had nothing to do with each other. They were sitting cross-legged, and each one seemed to be doing something different. Nobody paid any attention to me when I walked in. I saw shoes lined up, and I thought maybe I am supposed to take off my shoes, but nobody said anything to me. So I walked around the edge of the carpet, looking for somebody to pay attention to me. I wondered what was going on and didn't want to interrupt anybody because they all seemed deep into whatever kind of prayers they were doing. In the back of the loft, I noticed a little curtain, an Indian Madras type of curtain, and I decided I would peer into that area. I looked in, and there was Swami Bhaktivedanta sitting there, cross-legged in saffron garment, with the marking of his forehead and nose and his hand in the bead bag. Even though he looked like the real thing, he seemed more approachable. And I said, "Hello." And he looked up. I said, "Swami Bhaktivedanta." And he said, "Yes." I said, "I am Howard Smith." I was expecting to sit down, so I said, "Excuse me, I have to take off my shoes." And he said, "Why? Do you want to take off your shoes?" I said, "I don't know. I saw all the shoes out there." And he said, "I didn't ask you to take your shoes off." I said, "What are all those people out there doing?" And he said, "I don't know." And they don't know what they are doing. I'm trying to teach them and they seem to be misunderstanding me. They are very confused people. Then we sat and talked, and I liked him a lot right away. I mean, I had met a lot of other swamis, and I didn't like them too much. And I don't think it's a fair to lump them all together and say those swamis in India, because he was very, very basic, and that's what I seem to like about him. He not only made me feel at ease, but he seems very open and honest. Like he asked many advice on things. He was very new in country. I thought his ideas stood a good chance to taking hold because he seemed too practical. His head didn't seem in the clouds. He wasn't talking mysticism every third word. I guess that is when his soul was it, but that isn't where his normal conversation consciousness was at. Then he said several people had told him that the voice would be a very good place to be written up and that basically it would reach the kind of people who already perhaps had a learning or interest in what he was preaching. And I said that I thought he was correct. He asked me if I had read any books or knew anything about Indian culture. And I said I didn't readily, really. We walked a little and he explained to me that he had these books in English that he had already translated in India. And he handed those to me and said, if you want more backgrounds, you can read these. It was obvious to me that I was not talking to some fellows who had just decided that he had seen God and was going to tell people about it. He seemed to be an educated man, much more than myself actually, and I liked his humbleness. I just plain, plain liked the guy. He explained everything I wanted to know. The significance of what he was wearing, the mark of his forehead, the bean bag, and I liked all his explanations. Everything was very practical. Then he talked about temples all over the world, and he said, well, we have got a long way to go, but I am very patient. Prabhupada had hope for what the Voice article had referred to as his American church. There was life in his lecture and kirtans, and at least he was acquiring a small regular following. But from India, there was no hope. He had continued corresponding with Swami Morarji, his god brother, and the Indian general government, but their replies had not been encouraging. In the faith that Padmapat Singhania would agree to his plans for a Krishna temple in Manhattan and finance his constructions, Prabhupada has had patience New Delhi to sanction the release of foreign exchange. He had written to Reserve Bank of India, New Delhi. I want to establish this culture center, and for this I wish to get some exchange from India. I think there are good prospects all over the world for propagating the culture of how to love God in these days of forgetfulness. A month later, the Indian Bank had advised him to resubmit his request through the Indian Embassy in Washington to the Finance Minister in Indian central government. Prabhupada had compiled, and another month had passed with no words from the government. One of his god brother had written that Swamiji should come back to India and work personally to get the government's sanction, but Prabhupada didn't want to leave right now. He wrote to Sumati Morarji, I'm trying to avoid the journey to India and again coming back, especially for the reason that I am holding at the above address classes thrice a week and training some American youth in the matter of Sanskrit and devotional service of the Lord. Some of them are taking the lesson very sincerely, and in the future they may be very good Vaishnavas according to the rigid set standards. One day, a curious, unsolicited correspondent wrote to Prabhupada from India. His name was Mukti Brahmachari, introducing himself as a disciple of one of the Prabhupada's god brother and reminding Prabhupada of their past light acquaintance. Mukti wrote of his eagerness to join Prabhupada in America. Certainly, Prabhupada still had hopes for getting assistance from the God brother in India. This mission is not a simple one man's work. Therefore, he invited Mukti to come to America and asked him to request his guru to correspond by working personally to secure government sanction for the release of foreign exchange. Mukti wrote back, reaffirming his eagerness but expressing doubt that spiritual master would give him permission. Mukti thought he should first come to the United States and then request his spiritual master's help. Prabhupada was annoyed and he sent the immediate reply. His preaching in America is my private business. Srila Prabhupada Bhaktivedanta Swami Saraswati wanted to construct some temples in foreign countries of preaching centers of the message of Srila Rupa Raghunath, and I'm trying to do this in the part of the world. The money is ready and the opportunity is open. If by seeing the finance minister this work can be facilitated, why should we wait? Because you can talk with your Guru Maharaj about the cooperation because you are afraid your journey will be cancelled. Please do not think in that way. Take everything as and Srila Rupa Goswami and Srila Raghunatha Das Goswami were two leading disciples of Lord Chaitanya in 16th century. The Swami Prabhupada worked and tried to do the needful. Do not think for the moment that my interest is different from that of your Guru Maharaj. We are executing the wall of Srila Prabhupada according to our own capacity. The combined effort would have been far better. Mukti submitted the entire proposal before the spiritual master, who, as Mukti predicted, cancelled the trip. Although Mukti's guru was Srila Prabhupada's god brother, he did not want to be involved, and he doubted that Prabhupada would actually get a donation from the Padampat Singhania. And now Mukti Brahmachari also doubted. If your program is not bona fide, the approach of the big personality will be a ludicrous one of doubt. One of the same day, the Prabhupada received the ludicrous letter. He also received the final blow of the non-cooperation from the Indian government. Second Secretary Prakash Shah of the Indian Embassy of Washington, D.C. wrote, due to the existing condition of foreign exchange stringy, it is not possible for the government of India to accede to your request for release of foreign exchange. You may perhaps like to raise funds for resident in America. It was confirmed Prabhupada would have to work without outside help. He would continue alone in New York City. His last letter to Mukti Brahmachari reveals his deep faith and determinations. So the controversy is now closed, and there is no need of help from anyone else. We are not always successful in our attempts at preaching work, but such failure are certainly not ludicrous. In the absolute field, both success and failure are glorious. Even Lord Nityananda pretended to be a failure and converting Jagai and Madhai at the first attempt. Rather, he was personally injured in such an attempt, but that was certainly not ludicrous. The whole thing was transcendental, and it was glorious for the parties concerned. If Krishna consciousness were even to take hold in America, it would have to be without assistance from the Indian government or Indian financiers. Not even a lone Indian brahmachari would join him. Krishna was revealing his plan to Prabhupada in a different way. With the Singhania sanction schemes finished and behind him, Prabhupada would turn all his energy toward the young men and women coming to him in the Bowery loft. He wrote a Sumit Morarji. I am now trying to incorporate and corporation of the local friends and admirers under the name International Society of Krishna Consciousness Incorporated. Hare Krishna. Of all his friends and admirers, Prabhupada gave him roommate David Allen the most personal attention and training. He felt he was giving David a special chance to become America's first genuine Vaishnava. Prabhupada would eventually return to India and he wanted to take David to Vrindavana. He would show his temple worship and train him for further preaching in the West. He had requested Sumati Morarji to provide free passage for David as well as for himself. You'll be pleased to see this American boy. He's coming of a good family and a sincere soul of this line of culture. There are others also in the class I'm holding here, but I wish to take with me only one of them. I am very glad to say Prabhupada said one evening in this lecture that our Mr. David says sometimes, Swamiji, I want to increase my spiritual life immediately. Prabhupada laughed as he imitated David's urgency. Take patience, take patience. I tell him it will be done. Of course, when you have got such desire, God will help you. He is within you. He simply try to see how sincere you are. Then he will give you the opportunity to increase your spiritual life. After first David and the Swami lived together peacefully in the large hall, the Swami working concentratedly on his side of the partition, David ranging throughout the large open space. David, however, continued taking marijuana, LSD, and amphetamines, and Prabhupada had no choice but to tolerate it. Several times he told David that drugs and hallucinations would not help his spiritual life, but David would took this distracted. He was becoming estranged from the Swami, but Prabhupada had a plan to use the loft as a temple, to transfer it into New York's first temple of Radha Krishna. And he wanted David's cooperation all through. The neighborhood was one of the most miserable in the world. Prabhupada talked of bringing deities from Jaipur or Vrindavana and starting temple worship, even of the Bowery. He thought David might help. After all, they were roommates, so there could be no question of David's not cooperating, but he would have to give up his bad habits. Prabhupada was trying to help David, but David was too disturbed. He was headed for disaster, and so were Prabhupada's plan for the loft. Sometimes even not under the influence of the drug. He would pace around the loft. Other times he appeared to be deep in thoughts. One day, on a dose of LSD, he went completely crazy. As Carl Jurgens put it, he just flipped out, and the Swami had to deal with the crazy man. Things had been leading to this. He was a crazy kid who always took too much, but the real madness happened suddenly. Swami was working peacefully at his typewriter when David freaked out. David started mowing and pacing around the large open area of the loft. Then he began yelling, howling, and running all around. He went back to where the Swami was. Suddenly, Prabhupada found himself face to face not with David, nice David, whom he was going to take to India to show the Brahmanas in Vrindavan, but the drugged, wild-eyed stranger and madman. Prabhupada tried to speak to him. What is this matter? But David had nothing to say. There was no particular disagreement, just madness. Prabhupada moved quickly down the 4 flights of stairs. He had not stopped to gather up any of the belongings or even to decide where he would go or whether he would return. There had been no time to consider anything. He had taken quite a shock, and now he was leaving the area of David's madness. The usual groups of bums were sitting in the doorway, and with their customary flourish and courtesy, they allowed him to pass. They were used to elderly swamis coming in and out, going shopping and returning, and they didn't bother him. But he was not going shopping today. Where was he going? He didn't know. He had come onto the street without knowing where he would go. He wasn't going back to the loft. That was for sure. But where could he go? The pigeon flew from to roof. Traffic rumbled by, and the ever-present bombs loitered about getting drunker on cheap, poisonous alcohol. All through Prabhupada's home had suddenly become an insane terror. The street, as its door, was also a hellish, dangerous place. He was shaken. He could call Dr. Mishra's and they might take him in. But that chapter of his life was over, and he had gone on to sometimes think better. He had his own classes, young people chanting and hearing. Was it all over now? After 9 months in America, he had finally gotten a good response to his preaching and kirtans. He couldn't just quit now. A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Maharaj, whom everyone knew and respected in Vrindavana as a distinguished scholar and a devotee, who had an open invitation to see the Vice President of India and many other nobles, now had to face straightly that he had not one friend of states with the United States. Suddenly he was homeless, as an derelict on the street. In fact, many of them, with their long-time brothers or birds of the flop houses, were more secure than he was. They were ruined, but settled. The Bowery could be a chaotic, aquatic hell if you were on a very purposeful errand, going directly to the store or back to your place. It was no place to stand, wondering where will you live or is there a friend you can turn to. He wasn't on his way to Chinatown to shop, nor was he taking a little stroll, soon to return to the shelter of the loft. If he couldn't go to the loft, he had no place. How difficult it was becoming to preach in America amid these crazy people. He had written prophetically in his poem the day he had arrived in Boston Harbor. My dear Lord, I do not know why you have brought me here. Now you can do with me whatever you like, but I guess you have some business where otherwise, why would you bring me to this terrible place? What about his scheduled classes? What about David? Should he go back and try to talk with the boy? This had been David's first fit of violence, but there had been other tense moments. David had a habit of leaving the soap on the floor of the shower stall, and the Prabhupada had asked him not to because it was a hazard. But David wouldn't listen. Prabhupada had continued to remind him, and one day David had gotten angry and shouted at him. But there was no real enmity. Even today's incident had not been a matter of personal differences. The boy was a victim. Prabhupada walked quickly. He had free passages of the Sea India line. He could go home to Vrindavan, but his spiritual master has ordered him to come here. By the strong desire of Srimad Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he had written while crossing the Atlantic, the holy name of Lord Gauranga will spread throughout all the countries of the Western world. Before nightfall, he would have to find some place to stay, a way to keep up the momentum of his preaching. This is what it means to be working without government sponsorship, without the support of any religious organization, without a patron. It meant being vulnerable and insecure. Prabhupada faced the crisis as a test from Krishna. The instructions of Bhagavad Gita was to depend on Krishna was protection. In all activities, just depend upon me and work always under my protection. In such a devotional service, be fully conscious of me. You will pass over all the obstacles and conditional life by my grace. He decided to phone call Jurgens and ask him to help. Hearing the Swami's voice on the phone, it was an emergency. Carl at once agreed with Prabhupada could move in with him and his wife, Eva. Their place was close by on Central Street, 5 blocks west to Bowery near China. To Carl would be the ride over. After Carl found Prabhupada, they went straight to Carl's place and AIR loft, smaller than the one Prabhupada had been living in. It had a main living area, large and open with areas from the kitchen and the bedroom partitioned off. There were decorative indoor plants or the profusion of the throw pillows placed around. Carl's loft was much brighter than the dingy, factory-like space in the loft of the Bowery. The floor was painted bright orange. Carl used to say it looked like the deck of the ship. The walls and the ceiling were white, and the light from the seven skylight filled the room. Carl and Eva settled the Swami in the one corner. Prabhupada had left his belongings at David's loft and didn't want to go back, so Carl went over to pick up a few essential items. Prabhupada asked him to leave most of his things, including his books, suitcase, and reel-to-reel tape recording where they were. Although by the time David had come down from the intense effects of the LSD, he remained crazy. When Carl arrived at the loft, the door was locked and David was inside, afraid of let anyone in. All through, finally, he relented. He had shut and locked all the windows, making the loft oppressively hot and stuffy. Bill Espatine, who also came by the day, analyzed David as having had a drug-induced nervous breakdown and narcopsychosis, and all through David was sorry he had explored at the Swami. Neither Bill nor Carl through Prabhupada should live with David again. Apparently, Prabhupada chance to making the loft into Radha Krishna temple were finished. Carl and Bill gathered up a few of the Swami's belongings and David stayed behind in the loft. He wanted to be alone. Carl Jugners knew Prabhupada's living habits and wanted to accommodate him with a suitable place to live and work. In a small alcove at the one end of his loft, Carl had a small study which he allocated for the Swami. Carl also set up the cushion chair and arranged the living room around it so that guests could sit on the floor in the semicircle. Karl's wife, who didn't really like the idea of Swami's moving in, agreed to cover a few cushions with the Indian Madras material for him anyway. Things went smoothly for a while. Prabhupada continued his morning and evening classes, and many of the Bauri hip crowded came by. Three of his regular callers lived right in the same building, and the few others, including Carl's brother, were just around the block. Michael Grant, James Green, and David Allen came once. Don Nathanson, an artist. I was at Carl's loft, and the Swami comes strolling in the one day, so I already knew he was on the scene from the Davies. Mostly musicians were coming. They were enjoying the private morning session with him. And that's really strange in itself because these people were up almost all night and he used to do it at 6 in the morning. For 1 hour, he would lead them in the chanting with his hand symbols. Da, 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 da. It was strange because that crowd was heavy into drugs and they were well read. But for the short period, they used to go every morning, 9 or 10 of them, and they felt very good about it. They felt very good that they did that in the morning. Carl felt that the creative group
Mataji,
who
I can read if you want. I
okay,
can
let me
continue
finish
if you
this
want. Otherwise, you can just. Okay.
I'll finish this paragraph, then you can continue, Mataji. Carl felt that the
Okay, Mataji.
creative group who came to see the Swamis in the studio were all quick to enter into the mood of the Kirtana, but they were using in their own ways to supplement their own private vision of aesthetics with no real intention of adopting the disciplines disciplines or the undivided worship of Lord Krishna. Prabhupada was their first real contact with the spiritual person, and yet, even without trying to understand, they become absorbed in his kirtanas and in what he had to say. Carl would invite them, "Hey, come in. This is genuine. This is a real. You will like it. It is music. It is dance. It's a celebration." Carl saw that people just felt good being in the Swami's presence and meditating on the chanting and eating and Swami's cooking. It was unlike anything they had experienced before, except maybe for the moment of the creative insight. Hare Krishna. Okay, Mataji.
Yeah. Yet for Carl and Eva, Prabhupada's simple presence created difficulty. Never before during his whole stay in America had he been a more inconvenient or unwanted guest. Carl's studio was arranged for him and his wife to live in alone, using the bedroom, kitchen, and living room any way they liked. If they wanted to smoke marjua or eat meat or whatever, that was their prerogative. This was Carl's home. He lived here with his wife Eva and their dogs and cats, but now they had to share it with the Swami. Almost at once, the situation became intolerable for Eva. She resented the Swami's presence in her home. She was a feminist, a liberated white woman with a black husband and a good job. She did not like the Swami's views on women. She hadn't read his books or attended his classes, but she had heard that he was opposed to sexual intercourse except for conceiving children, and that in his view, a woman was supposed to be shy and chaste and help her husband in spiritual life. She knew about the Swami's four rules: no meat eating, illicit sex, intoxication, or gambling. And she did not want Carl's Swami trying to change their ways to suit his. And he had better not expect her to wait on him as his servant. She sensed the Swami objecting to almost everything she did. If she were to seek his advice, he would probably ask her to stop taking drugs, get rid of the cats and dogs, stop drinking, and stop contraceptive sex. If the Swami had his way, they would probably eat only at certain times and only certain foods. Eva was a heavy smoker, so he probably would not like being around her. She was ready for a confrontation. But Prabhupada was not one to make intolerant demands while living in another's home. He kept to his allotted corner of the loft, and he made no demands or criticisms. Hadn't he seen his host in Butler eating meat and only remarked, thinking nothing of it? Nevertheless, his imposing spiritual presence made Eva sorry Karl had ever met him. To Eva, the Swami was an inimical force, and she, being candid and independent, let him know. As soon as he asked whether she could bring him something, she replied, "Get it yourself." Carol Baker saw the situation as being extremely uncomfortable and tense. Eva was quite resentful. Eva complained to Carol. Here, she was paying rent for the loft, working hard, and this man was trying to change their way of life. Carol. Eva could not handle his teachings, and she could not handle his influence over Karl. She did not feel so constrained, but she felt that Swamiji was making Karl feel constrained. This was Eva's main objection. The Swami was influencing Karl. Her relationship with Karl had only recently begun, and Karl was aware that she needed much of his time. He agreed with his wife, yet he could not refuse the Swami. He was interested in Indian music, poetry, and religions, and here was a living authority, vastly knowledgeable in all facets of Indian culture, right in his home. Prabhupada would cook his meals in their kitchen, and right away Karl would be there, eager to learn the art of Indian cuisine. Karl also wanted the Swami to show him how to play the drum. They would have long talks together. Karl was trying to be something he really wasn't, but he would never have suggested that the Swami had to leave. Swami, I'm sure, was astute enough to pick up on this tension. As soon as he could, he tried to move to another place. Gradually, Karl reached an impasse in his relationship with Prabhupada. He could not share his life with both his wife and Swami, and ultimately he was more inclined toward his wife. Karl, I could not see my loft becoming a temple. I was raising cats and dogs, and he wanted them removed. He used to call me a meat eater, but then he changed our diet. Of course, he was hitting the American culture, which doesn't know what all this business is. I have to put it on myself as much as anyone. I could understand and observe India through an impersonal agency like a book or a record, but here was the living representative of Godhead, and to me it was difficult as anything I have ever had to do before or since. Prabhupada was not insensitive to the distress his presence was causing. He did not want to inconvenience anyone, and of course he could have avoided all inconvenience, both for himself and for people like Eva, if he had never come to America. But he wasn't concerned with convenience or inconvenience, pleasing Eva or displeasing her. He wanted to teach Krishna consciousness. Prabhupada had a mission, and Karl's loft did not seem to be the right base for it. Prabhupada's friends all agreed he should move more into the center of things. The Bowery and Chinatown were too far out of the way. They would find him a new place. Forced by conditions he accepted as Krishna's mercy, Prabhupada sat patiently, trying not to disturb anyone, yet speaking about Krishna consciousness day and night. Karl assured him that with half a dozen people searching, it wouldn't take long to find a new place, and they would all chip in together and help him with the rent. A week passed, and no one had found a suitable place for the Swami. One day, Prabhupada suggested that he and Carl take a walk up to Michael Grant's place and ask him to help. Mike, I was awakened one morning very early, and Carl was on the phone saying, Swamiji and I were just taking a walk, and we thought we would come up and see you. I said, but it's too early in the morning. And he said, well, Swamiji wants to see you. They were very nearby, just down the street, so I had to quickly get dressed, and by the time I got to the door, they were there. I was totally unprepared, but invited them up. The television had been on from the previous night, and there was some cartoons on. The Swami sat between Carl and me on the couch. I was keeping a pet cat, and the cat jumped up on Swamiji's lap, and he abruptly knocked it off onto the floor. We began to talk, but Swamiji glanced over at the cartoons on the television, said, this is nonsense. Suddenly I realized that the television was on and that it was nonsense. And I got up very quickly saying, why, yes, it is nonsense, and turned it off. As Prabhupada talked, he tried to impress on Mike how difficult it was for him to live with Carl and Eva, and Mike listened. But was the Swami so sure he couldn't go back to the Bowery loft and live with David Allen? Except for that one incident, it had been a nice setup, hadn't it? Prabhupada explained that David had become a madman from too much LSD. He was dangerous. Mike gave the Swami a half incredulous look. David Allen, dangerous? Prabhupada then told a story. There's an old saying in India that you get yourself a spiritual master, you sit opposite him, you learn everything from him that you can, then you kill him, you move his body to one side, and then you sit in his place and you become the guru. As Prabhupada spoke, Mike began to feel that David was dangerous, so he did not ask for any more details. Mike could see that Swamiji was appealing to him for help, and as they all sat together on the couch, Mike and Carl quietly nodded in agreement. The Swami was looking at Mike, and Mike was trying to think. So, how can we help Swamiji? Carl interjected. Mike explained that he was a pianist and he had to practice every day. He had 2 pianos, 2 sets of drums, a vibraphone, and other instruments right there in his apartment. Musicians were always coming over to practice, and they all played their instruments for hours. Also, he was living with a girl, and there was a cat in the apartment. But Mike promised that he would help find the Swami a new place. Prabhupada thanked him, and along with the Carl stood to leave. Mike felt obligated. He was good at getting things done, and he wanted to do this for the Swami. So the next day he went to the Village Voice, got the first newspaper off the press, looked through the classified ads until he found a suitable prospect and phoned the landlord. It was a storefront on 2nd Avenue, and an agent, a Mr. Gardiner, agreed to meet Mike there. Carl and the Swami also agreed to come. Mr. Gardner and Mike were the first to arrive. Mike noted the unusual hand-painted sign, matchless gifts, above the front window. It was a holdover, Mr. Gardner explained, from when the place had been a nostalgic gift shop. Mike proceeded to describe the Swami as a spiritual leader from India, an important author, and a Sanskrit scholar. The rental agent seemed receptive. As soon as Prabhupada and Carl arrived and everyone had been congenially introduced, Mr. Gardner showed them the small storefront. Prabhupada, Carl, and Mike carefully considered its possibilities. It was empty, plain, and dark. The electricity had not been turned on, and it needed repainting. It would be good for meetings, but not for Swami's residence. But at $125 a month, it seemed promising. Then Mr. Gardner revealed a small second-floor apartment just across the rear courtyard, directly behind the storefront. Another $71 a month, and the Swami could live there. Although first Mr. Gardner would have to repaint it. The total rent would come to $196, and Carl, Mike, and others would pitch in. Prabhupada had the idea of making Mr. Gardner the first official trustee of his fledgling Krishna Consciousness Society. During their conversation, he presented Mr. Gardner with a 3-volume set of his Srimad Bhagavatam, and inside the front cover, he wrote a personal dedication and then signed it, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami. Mr. Gardner felt flattered and honored to receive these books from their author himself. He agreed to become a trustee of the new Society for Krishna Consciousness and so pay the society $20 a month. Mr. Gardner took a week to paint the apartment. Meanwhile, Mike arranged for the electricity and water to be turned on and had a phone installed, and he and Carl raised the first month's rent among their friends. When everything was ready, Mike gave Prabhupada a call to calls. Now it was time to move the Swami into his new place. A few friends who were on hand accompanied the Swami over to the Bobbery loft. Maybe they weren't prepared to become his surrendered disciples, but contributing toward the first month's rent and volunteering a few hours of work to help set up his place were exactly the kinds of things they could do very willingly. At the loft, they all gathered up portions of the Swami's belongings, and then they started out on foot up Bobbery. It was like a safari, a caravan of half a dozen men loaded with Prabhupada's things. Michael carried the heavy Roberts reel to reel, and even the Swami carried 2 suitcases. They did everything so quickly that it wasn't until they were well on their way and Mike's arm began to ache that he realized, why did not we bring a car? It was the end of June and a hazy summer sun poured its heat down into the Bobbery jungle. Starting and stopping, the strange safari stretching for over a block slowly trekked along. Prabhupada struggled with his suitcases past the seemingly unending row of restaurants, supply shops, and lamp stores between Grand, Broome, and Spring Streets. Sometimes he paused and rested, setting his suitcases down. He was finally moving from the Bobbery. His electrician friend on 72nd Street would have been relieved, although perhaps he could have disapproved of the 2nd Avenue address also. At least he was finished residing on Skid Row. He walked on, past the homeless men outside the Salvation Army shelter, past the open-door taverns, stopping at streetlights, standing alongside total strangers, keeping an eye on the progress of his procession of friends who struggled along behind him. The Bovary artists and musicians saw him as highly evolved. They felt that the spirit was moving him and were eager to help him set up his own place so that he could do his valuable spiritual thing and spread it to others. He was depending on them for help, yet they knew he was on a higher level. He was his own protector, or as he said, God protected him. The Swami and his young friends reached the corner of the Bowery and Houston, turned right and proceeded east. Gazing steadily ahead as he walked, Prabhupada saw the southern end of the 2nd Avenue 1 block away. At 2nd Avenue, he would turn left, walk just 1 block north across First Street, and arrive at his new home. As he passed the I&D subway entrance, the storefront came into view, matchless gifts. He gripped his suitcases and moved ahead. At 2nd Avenue and Houston, he hurried through a break in the rapid traffic. He could see green trees holding their heads above the high courtyard wall, reaching up like overgrown weeds in the space between the front and rear buildings of his new address. The street side building housed his meeting hall, the rear building the apartment where he would live and translate. Adjoining the storefront building on its north side was a massive 9-story warehouse. The storefront structure was only 6 stories and seemed appendant to the larger building, like its diminutive child. On its southern side, Prabhupada's new temple showed a surface of plain cement and was free of any adjoining structure. There was only the spacious lot of the busy mobile service station that bordered on First Street. As Prabhupada approached the storefront, he could see 2 small lanterns decorating the narrow doorway. There was no certainty of what awaited him here, but already there had been good signs that these American young people, mad though they sometimes were, could actually take part in Lord Chaitanya's Sankirtana movement. Perhaps this new address would be the place where he could actually get a footing with his International Society for Krishna Consciousness.
Haribol, it's quite an intense reading today, full 2 hours stretch.
Yeah, it's a long chapter. Yes, Prabhu.
Okay, anyone want to say anything quickly? So thought is problems will be there. So just focus on Krishna and try to keep your consciousness high and keep moving on. Chintamani Mataji was saying something.
Yeah, no, I was agreeing. Actually, yeah. I mean, the difficulties he had to go through, it's really
Yeah, such a Swamiji, such an elevated personality has to go through this someone's
madness, some family's house, many things.
insecurities. The lady has a trauma, so she's just projecting on him.
But now he is in the right place where ISKCON
Hope
got.
so.
Yeah, I mean, this is where ISKCON got registered. So yeah.
You know the story.
Matchless gifts.
Okay, Hare Krishna, everyone. We'll see you back tomorrow. And the chapter going to be chapter 18, Breaking Ground. As Chintamani Mataji is hinting, it's a breaking ground. Okay, Haribol.
Hare
Hare Krishna, everybody.
Hare Krishna.
Haribol Mataji, I'm gonna step out for a minute, okay?
Yes, Prabhu, I'll start reading, Prabhu.
You can wait for someone, no? Instead of you being alone.
Well,
I'll just step out.
okay, Prabhu.
Yeah.